Before kings wore crowns, before the pyramids pierced the sky, there was only the river, the Nile, silent, steady, eternal. It did not just water the land, it awakened a civilization. Over thousands of years, as the river carved its way through stone and sand, it gave birth to people who farmed, built, and dreamed. They raised huts from mud. They hunted beside sacred reeds. They planted the seeds of what would become one of the world's greatest empires. This is the story of Egypt before it was Egypt, of a people who spoke through symbols, who worshipped the flood, and who built their world from the heartbeat of the river. Close your eyes. Let the Nile carry you to the dawn of history. And if this journey brings you peace tonight, leave a like, share it with a fellow dreamer, and let me know in the comments which part of Egypt's past you'd love to explore next. Now let us begin. Long before pyramids pierced the sky, before pharaohs wore crowns of red and white, there was only water and sand, sky and silence, and a great river flowing through it all, the Nile. In the stillness of time, before written words, cities, or kings, there was the river. The Nile did not yet have names carved into temples or gods painted on its shores. It simply flowed, slow and steady, cutting its path through an ancient, endless desert. Around 10,000 years ago, long before even the first dynasty, humans wandered here. Nomads, hunters, gatherers. They followed herds through tall grasses, moved with the changing seasons, and drank from the water's edge. These people lived without stone homes or writing or monuments, but they lived with the land. They listened to the birds overhead and watched the stars move across the night sky. They knew the rhythm of the flood long before they could measure it. They were the first to understand the river's breath, and so they began to stay, not all at once, but slowly, like the river shaping its banks. They settled in small clusters along the edges of the floodplain, in places where the soil was black, rich, and soft. Here, the river gave them a gift. Not gold, not glory, but life. They grew barley and emmer wheat. They gathered wild figs and hunted fish with sharpened bone harpoons. They made pottery from clay and shaped it with careful hands. Some black-topped, some painted with simple red swirls. They lived simply, but not without soul. By around 6000 BCE, these early settlers began to build huts from mud and reeds. Their villages lined the edges of the Nile like pearls on a string. In the north, near the marshy delta, people gathered near the fertile wetlands. In the south, where the Nile cut between cliffs, settlements took root in narrow valleys. We know their names today not by what they called themselves, but by what archaeologists later found. Pottery, tools, burial sites, bones. Cultures like the Fayum A, Badarian, and Tasian gave way to more advanced groups like Nakata I and II. With each layer of soil uncovered, we see a story slowly unfolding. A story of experimentation, of creativity, of rising complexity. They built storage pits for grain. They carved ivory combs and made beads from seashells. They buried their dead with bowls of food and ornaments, as if to feed them in another life. Even before writing, they seemed to believe in something more, something beyond the world they knew. In these earliest graves, we find bodies laid gently on their sides, facing west, toward the setting sun, the direction of death, perhaps, or renewal. On pots, we see images drawn with steady hands, boats with long curved prows, gazelles and flamingos, figures dancing or perhaps worshipping, spirits or stories. We do not know, but we feel the message. The Nakata II people carved animal shapes into stone pallets and created decorative combs with animal heads. Some figures had long outstretched arms, perhaps priests or early gods. Others held staffs or spears, hinting at status, leadership, or defense. The people who created these things didn't yet have kings, but they had meaning. They may not have built pyramids, but they built memory, and it has lasted. By 4000 BCE, a transformation had begun. Small villages began merging into larger settlements. Leaders emerged, perhaps elders, hunters, or the best harvesters. Tribes likely organized themselves under chieftains, and territory became something to protect. In the north, the people of the Mahdi culture built storage rooms, developed copper tools, and connected with the Levant. They traded with the outside world, bringing in exotic stones, shells, and even the idea of wine. In the south, near modern-day Luxor, the Naqada culture flourished. They made statues from stone, decorated tombs, and began organizing society by class. Their graves became more elaborate. Some had small chapels, others multiple rooms. Two worlds, both Egyptian, but different. The delta in the north was open, green, influenced by trade and travel. The valley in the south was closed, proud, deeply tied to the river's moods. And so, the concept of two lands began to form. One in the north wearing the red crown, one in the south wearing the white, bound by the same river yet divided by ambition and geography. At a site called Nabta Playa, near the western desert, a curious monument was built sometime around 5000 BCE. Stone circles, like Egypt's own Stonehenge, aligned to the rising of Sirius, the star that would one day signal the Nile flood. Why did these ancient people watch the stars? They had no writing, no calendars, no temples, and yet they mapped the sky with precision. Perhaps it was not to worship, but to understand. What they built in silence would later guide kings and priests for thousands of years. In these earliest centuries, Egypt was not yet a nation, but it was a soul. They did not have a word for pharaoh, but they painted the falcon, a symbol that would become Horus. They did not have temples, but they honored the ibis, later seen as Thoth, the god of wisdom. They worshipped the cow, whose strength pulled their plows, a spirit that would one day become Hathor. The mythology we know as Egyptian didn't appear suddenly. It grew like reeds along the Nile, one symbol, one story, one generation at a time. By 3300 BCE, power began to concentrate. Some tombs now had dozens of rooms, fine goods, and foreign treasures. Others, poorer graves, had only pottery and broken tools. Inequality had begun, and with it, the need for order. In the southern town of Hierakonpolis, Nekhen, a powerful ruler emerged, perhaps the first of many. His warriors wore leopard skins and carried ceremonial maces. His palace was made of wood and mud brick. His symbol, perhaps, a falcon perched on a standard. Nearby, in Abydos, early kings were buried with fleets of wooden boats. One ruler, possibly named Scorpion, wore a white crown and held a staff. These were no longer chieftains. They were pre-pharaohs, gods in waiting. And soon, one among them would rise. A man whose name would echo through eternity. A king who would take the red land and the black and make them one. And so, from scattered tribes and whispered prayers, the soul of Egypt stirred. The river had given life. Now it would give rise to kings. Not every kingdom is born in war. Some are born in silence. In the moment a river divides, and then unites again. Egypt did not begin with the swing of a sword. It began with a crown. Two, actually. A white one from the south, a red one from the north, and the man who dared to wear them both was Narmer. For centuries, Egypt existed as two distinct realms. Upper Egypt in the south, narrow, traditional, deeply rooted in the river's flow. Lower Egypt in the north, expansive, rich with marshlands and open to foreign influence. They traded, they clashed, they watched each other across the sacred Nile, never truly united, until one man changed it all. Around 3100 BCE, Narmer, a ruler from Upper Egypt, led a campaign north, not just to conquer, but to unify. He didn't just want power, he wanted order. And Egypt, with its growing villages, rival chieftains, and precious resources, needed a single hand to guide it. Our clearest glimpse of this turning point comes from a single object, a flat slab of stone carved over 5,000 years ago. Known today as the Narmer palette, it is both artwork and propaganda. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down a northern enemy. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, marching in triumph. In a single artifact, we see Egypt's birth as a nation, unified not just by war, but by vision. Narmer wasn't merely claiming land. He was fusing identities, blending gods, crowns, cultures, and symbols into something entirely new. To rule a united land, Narmer needed a new capital. He chose a site near the natural border between north and south, a place where the Nile spreads and bends. There, he founded a city called Ineb-Hej, meaning white walls. The Greeks would later call it Memphis. Strategically placed, Memphis became the center of Egypt's administration, economy, and religion. It wasn't just a city. It was a symbol where Upper and Lower Egypt became one. Temples rose, storehouses filled, priests and scribes gathered. The state was awakening. But Narmer didn't rule alone, not in theory. He ruled with the gods. This was the birth of something profound, the concept of the pharaoh. Not just a king, not just a man, but a living god on earth. Narmer became the lord of the two lands. He wore the double crown called the skent, a merging of the red and white. He was called the Two Ladies, referring to the cobra goddess Wadjet and the vulture goddess Nekbet, guardians of each land. From this point on, every ruler of Egypt would be seen as divine, chosen by the gods, maintaining a balance between chaos and order. The Egyptian word for that order was ma'at, truth, harmony, balance, and it was the pharaoh's duty to uphold it every day. A kingdom needs memory, and so, during this time, Egypt gave birth to one of humanity's oldest writing systems, hieroglyphs. At first, they were symbols carved into tombs or palace walls, a hawk for Horus, a reed for life, a zigzag for water. But they evolved quickly into a language of the gods and the state. Writing recorded taxes, births, trade, prayers, and the names of kings. Scribes were trained in temple schools. They didn't just record, they preserved. They were the memory keepers of Egypt. Even in life, the pharaoh planned for death. Tombs became larger, more elaborate. The kings of the first dynasty were buried in Abydos, a sacred site in southern Egypt. Rectangular structures called mastabas were built over their burial chambers. Beneath them, rooms for food, furniture, jewelry, and even sacrifice servants, so that the king would want for nothing in the afterlife. Around some tombs, rows of small graves suggest a royal court in death, mirroring the one in life. It may seem cruel to us now, but for them it was duty, to serve the divine ruler forever. Narmer's descendants, including rulers like Horaha, Jur, and Den, expanded on his vision. They organized Egypt into districts or nomes, each ruled by a governor, developed standardized measurements and tax systems, oversaw temple construction and state-run agriculture. Art began to follow rules, proportions, postures, sacred imagery. Everything had its place, its scale, its spiritual role. Egypt wasn't just unified in land. It was becoming unified in thought. At Memphis, the god Ptah rose in importance, patron of craftsmen, creator of the world through thought and speech. In Abydos, worship of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, began to spread. And in temples across the land, priests began rituals that would continue for thousands of years, lighting incense, chanting hymns, offering bread and beer to statues that housed divine power. Religion wasn't separate from the state. It was the state, and the pharaoh stood at its center, the bridge between the human and the eternal. What Narmer created wasn't just a political empire. It was a spiritual framework, a worldview that would endure invasions, droughts, and dynastic collapse. Egypt would rise and fall many times, But the image of the two crowns, the double cobra, the pharaoh as living god, these would remain untouched. Even Cleopatra, over 2,500 years later, would trace her power back to Narmer's unification. The river still flowed. The crowns were now one. The god-king sat on his throne, and Egypt had begun. The sand was still, the sky unbroken, and then, from the heart of the desert, stone began to rise. Not from chaos, not from conquest, but from order, from the steady hands of a builder, a dreamer, and a king who wanted to be remembered forever. This is not the story of war. This is the story of pyramids, of kings who reached for the stars and believed they could rise beyond death itself. Welcome to the Old Kingdom, the age when stone became eternity. Egypt's Old Kingdom began around 2686 BCE, and it didn't take long for greatness to rise from the sands. The first to make history in stone was a king named Djoser, ruler of Egypt's third dynasty. He was no ordinary king, and he didn't want an ordinary tomb. Until this point, Egyptian rulers had been buried in mastabas, low, flat, rectangular tombs made from mud brick. But Djoser dreamed of something more. He wanted to climb into the heavens. He turned to his most trusted advisor, a man whose name would outlive empires, Imhotep. Together, they built something no one had ever seen before, a stepped monument rising tier by tier toward the sky. At Saqqara, on a plateau overlooking the Nile, the first pyramid in history was born. The step pyramid stood over 200 feet high, made from solid limestone. 6 levels stacked like a staircase to the stars. This was more than a tomb. It was a temple, a symbol, a message carved in stone, that the king was no longer just a man, but a god who would live forever. The pyramid was surrounded by a vast mortuary complex. Courtyards, shrines, ceremonial spaces. Its white limestone casing shimmered in the sunlight, glowing like a beacon across the desert. For the first time, the afterlife was not just imagined. It was engineered. Behind every great monument is a mind, and for Djoser's pyramid, that mind was Imhotep. He wasn't a king, but his genius made him nearly divine. Imhotep was more than an architect. He was a high priest, a doctor, a scholar, and a visionary. He designed the first pyramid, invented new ways of cutting and placing stone, and laid the foundation for all monumental architecture to come. So profound was his influence that, centuries later, the Egyptians worshipped him as a god of wisdom and healing. Temples were built in his honor. Pilgrims came to pray at his shrines. His name became sacred, a rare honor for someone who wasn't royal. Imhotep's work on the step pyramid was revolutionary. Until then, no one had dared to build so high. No one had worked with stone on this scale. No one had imagined the tomb as a bridge between this world and the next. He didn't just change Egypt. He changed human history, and his design would become the blueprint for the wonders yet to come. After Djoser's time, Egypt was inspired but still learning. Then came a king who would push boundaries in every direction. His name was Sneferu, the first ruler of Egypt's fourth dynasty, and the father of pyramid building as we know it today. Unlike others, Sneferu didn't settle for one monument. He built not one, not two, but 3 massive pyramids, each more ambitious than the last. Sneferu's first pyramid rose at Midim. It began as a step pyramid like Djoser's, but with a twist. His builders tried to convert it into a smooth-sided structure by filling in the steps with limestone casing. It was bold. It was beautiful, but it was unstable. Over time, the outer casing collapsed, and today, Midim looks like a giant tower rising from rubble. Some call it the collapsed pyramid, but Sneferu didn't stop there. Further north, at Dashur, he tried again. This time, the pyramid rose steep and sharp, but halfway up, the builders realized it was too steep. The weight was too much, so they changed the angle mid-construction, creating a distinctive bend in the upper part. The result, the famous bent pyramid. It wasn't perfect, but it was a masterpiece of learning. And more importantly, it still does, like a giant stone lesson in geometry. Still unsatisfied, Snefru launched a third attempt, again at Dashur. This time, his architects got everything right. The Red Pyramid, named for the reddish limestone used in its core, became Egypt's first true, smooth-sided pyramid. The slope was stable, its chambers carefully planned, the size monumental. It was the final evolution of an idea that began with Djoser, and it set the stage for Egypt's greatest monument. Snefru's son was named Khufu. He inherited a stable, wealthy, confident Egypt and a challenge. How do you outdo the greatest pyramid builder of all time? Khufu's answer was bold. He would build a structure so massive, so perfect, that it would become a wonder of the world. Khufu chose a plateau west of the Nile, near the city of Memphis. It was high, flat, and sacred, a place fit for eternity. Construction began around 2580 BCE. Over the next 20-plus years, thousands of skilled workers, engineers, and craftsmen moved over 2 million blocks of stone, some weighing over 15 tons. The result? The Great Pyramid of Giza. Height: originally 481 feet, tallest structure in the world for 3,800 years. Base over 13 acres, almost perfectly square. Alignment: aligned almost exactly with the cardinal directions. Precision: the base is level within just 2 centimeters. Inside, the architecture is just as awe-inspiring. A descending passage leads to a mysterious, unfinished chamber beneath the pyramid. An ascending passage rises toward the Grand Gallery, a soaring, corbelled corridor leading to the king's chamber, built entirely from red granite. A giant sarcophagus rests inside, too large to have been placed after construction, meaning the entire structure was built around it. Contrary to popular myth, the pyramids were not built by slaves. Recent discoveries at workers' villages near Giza show that the laborers were skilled craftsmen, fed with high-quality food, and housed in organized teams. Their graffiti survives today, with names like the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu. It wasn't slavery, it was national pride. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a symbol of cosmic power, a calendar in stone, and an engine of Egypt's economy. After Khufu came his son, Khafre. He built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's, but perched on higher ground, making it appear just as grand. But Khafre's most iconic legacy wasn't his pyramid. It was what stood in front of it, the Great Sphinx, carved from a natural limestone outcrop left behind in the quarry. The Sphinx combined the body of a lion with the face of a king, likely Khafre himself. It symbolized power, wisdom, and divine protection. Even after 4,500 years, it still stands, weathered but proud, watching the sun rise over the Nile. Khafre's successor, Menkaure, completed the Giza trio. His pyramid was the smallest of the three, but his temple complex was more elaborate, with intricate statues and fine craftsmanship. Together, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure created a city of the dead so monumental that even in ruins, it commands awe. By the mid-4th dynasty, the pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was seen as Horus in life and Osiris in death, a living god walking the earth. The crown was more than a symbol of rule, it was a cosmic contract. When the pharaoh ruled well, Ma'at, the balance of the universe, was maintained. When he failed, chaos threatened to return. Everything depended on the pharaoh: the flood of the Nile, the harvest, the rising of stars. This belief gave pharaohs unmatched power and also a heavy burden. They weren't just rulers. They were responsible for the order of the world. Toward the end of the 5th dynasty, something profound began to appear inside royal tombs. Carved into the walls were hundreds of lines of sacred writing, spells, hymns, prayers, known today as the pyramid texts. They are the oldest known religious texts in the world. They were not meant for the living. They were written for the dead. The goal was to guide the pharaoh's soul safely through the underworld, past trials and demons, to be reborn with the sun god Ra, sailing across the sky in his solar boat. Death in Old Kingdom Egypt was not an ending. It was a transformation, a new life among the stars. While the pyramids captured the sky, it was the people who built them. Each year, during the flood season, when farming paused, tens of thousands of Egyptians worked on royal projects. They weren't slaves. They were farmers, stonemasons, carpenters, cooks, and brewers, conscripted by duty, fed well, housed decently, and paid in food and beer. Archaeological finds at Giza's worker villages reveal a complex support system: bakeries, medical areas, cemeteries, even team names written in graffiti, like the Drunkards of Menkor. Behind the monuments stood an engine of bureaucracy. Scribes, trained for years in temple schools, recorded everything: flood levels, grain stores, construction quotas, births, deaths, taxes. Without them, the pyramids would never have risen. As time passed, the weight of the system grew heavy. The last great pharaoh of the Old Kingdom was Pepi II of the 6th dynasty. He came to the throne as a child and ruled for more than 90 years, the longest reign in Egyptian history. But time eroded power. As Pepi aged, local governors, called nomarchs, grew stronger and more independent. Resources were stretched thin. Tombs became smaller, pyramids less precise. Worse still, the Nile's flood began to fail. Famine struck, and the divine king, too old, too distant, could no longer hold the realm together. By the end of his reign, Egypt began to fragment. The unity Narmer had created was crumbling. The sun still rose over the desert, but its light no longer fell on perfect white stone. It fell on broken walls, quiet temples, and tombs half-finished. The Old Kingdom, Egypt's first golden age, had built wonders that would outlive empires. But even pyramids cannot stop time. And as the sands began to shift again, Egypt entered its first age of darkness. Even the strongest stone will one day crack. Even the sunsets behind the pyramids. Egypt had once seemed eternal, a land of gods, geometry, and golden kings. But even gods grow old. Even kings pass away, and the river, once faithful and generous, began to fail. This is not the story of power. It is the story of its absence. The Old Kingdom had lasted for centuries. It gave the world pyramids, divine kingship, art, and order. But by the time Pepi II, Egypt's longest reigning pharaoh, breathed his final breath, the land was no longer united. He had ruled for more than 90 years. Too long, too far removed from the real world. And when he died, there was no strong successor. No great king to hold the two lands together. For the first time in centuries, Egypt fractured. The most devastating blow came not from war, but from the sky. The Nile, once predictable and nourishing, began to fail. Year after year, the floods came late or not at all. Fields turned dry, crops withered, granaries emptied. The people, once proud, now begged for bread. Inscriptions from this period speak not of conquest, but of famine. In the ancient text, the admonitions of Epur, a poet laments, "The river is dry, the poor have become rich, and the rich weep. Chaos is in the land." The land of Ma'at, balance and order, was slipping into chaos. Without a strong central pharaoh, governors of local provinces, called nomarchs, began to take control. Each nome, district, acted like a small kingdom. Some governors ruled fairly. Others hoarded grain, raised private armies, and crowned themselves kings. What had once been one Egypt was now many small Egypts, each competing, sometimes fighting, often ignoring each other. Some cities stayed loyal to the memory of the Old Kingdom. Others looked only to survive. The central government in Memphis faded into memory. Power now lived in the provinces. In the north, a city called Heracleopolis became a power center. It claimed to speak for the kings of old and sought to restore order. In the south, however, a rising power emerged: Thebes. Egypt was now split. The north held the ancient capital and old temples. The south, younger and more ambitious, prepared for something new. But for decades, there was no single ruler. Pharaohs came and went, none remembered. Tombs from this period are smaller. Monuments faded. Even the gods seemed silent. Yet even in darkness, people lived. And where people live, they create. The art of this era is rougher, less perfect than Old Kingdom styles. But it is more human. We see images of hunger, fighting, grief, and quiet dignity. Scribes still wrote, craftsmen still carved, and in small village shrines, prayers still rose to the heavens. The people of Egypt did not forget who they were. They were tired, hungry, divided, but they remembered. In a time without kings, people turned deeper toward the gods. But now it wasn't just Ra, the sun god, or Horus, the kingly falcon. Now they prayed to Osiris, the god of death and rebirth, a god who understood pain. They whispered to Anubis, guide of souls. They feared Set, the god of chaos, perhaps now more real than ever. Temples became smaller, but more personal. Religion shifted from royal power to private hope. The myths of death and return grew stronger because the people of Egypt needed to believe that they too would rise again. By the end of the 11th century BCE, Egypt's story was far from over. In the south, a new line of rulers began to emerge from Thebes. These were not kings from old bloodlines. They were warlords, survivors, leaders chosen by need, not birthright. One among them, Mentuhotep II, would rise above all. He began a slow campaign to reunite Egypt under one crown, not with poetry, but with strategy. And after years of effort, Egypt would become whole again. Not every age is golden. Some are forged in fire. Some are born from loss. The first intermediate period was Egypt's first collapse, a time when pyramids no longer rose and kings no longer reigned. But even in ruin, the spirit of Egypt endured. It waited, it watched, and soon, it would rise again. Some nations rise with glory, others rise from ruin. Egypt had once stood as the jewel of the world, a kingdom of pyramids and divine kings. But then came drought, chaos, silence. The first intermediate period left the land fractured. Yet the Nile still flowed, and beneath the dust of fallen dynasties, hope stirred. This is the story of Egypt's rebirth, of a forgotten city called Thebes, and the kings who rose not from gold, but from grit. This is the Middle Kingdom, the age of reunification, renaissance, and reform. The man who brought Egypt back from the brink was Mentuhotep II, a warrior king from Thebes. He didn't inherit a united land. He earned it. For decades, Egypt had been split, with Heracleopolis ruling the north and Thebes holding the south. Mentuhotep marched north with his armies, and by around 2055 BCE, he succeeded in what no one had done for a century. He reunited the two lands under one crown. He restored Ma'at, the balance of the cosmos. And for that, he was remembered not just as a king, but as a restorer of the world. With unification complete, Mentuhotep made Thebes the symbolic capital. Though Memphis remained politically important, Thebes became Egypt's spiritual center, home to the Temple of Ammonius, a god whose power would grow in the centuries to come. At Deir el-Bahari, Mentuhotep built a unique mortuary temple, not a pyramid, but a terraced structure that blended architecture with the cliffs behind it. It was a message. A new Egypt had dawned, and it looked south. Mentuhotep's successors continued to restore order, collecting taxes, repairing canals, and reviving temple rituals. But the dynasty was short-lived. Internal strife and weak heirs opened the door for a new family to rise. And with them came the golden age of the Middle Kingdom, the 12th dynasty. The 12th dynasty began with Amenemhat I, a former vizier who rose to kingship around 1985 BCE. He wasn't born into power, he seized it. And like all great reformers, he brought change. Amenemhat moved the capital north to a new city, Ichtoi, Caesar of the Two Lands. Strategically located near the Fayum oasis, it gave better control over both Upper and Lower Egypt. This shift wasn't just geographic. It was symbolic. The balance of north and south was restored. Amenemhat strengthened the bureaucracy, reigned in local governors, and centralized rule. He began building projects, temples, irrigation canals, and modest pyramids echoing the Old Kingdom style. But unlike the Fourth Dynasty kings, he focused more on governance than grandeur. He left behind something even more powerful than stone, a literary work known as The Instruction of Amenemhat, a text of political wisdom. In it, he warns his son, "Trust no brother, know no friend. When you sleep, guard your heart." He ruled with caution and with vision. Perhaps the greatest ruler of the Middle Kingdom was Senusret III. Tall, broad-chested, and often depicted with a weary, furrowed brow. He looked more like a soldier than a god, and that was no accident. Senusret III led military campaigns into Nubia, securing Egypt's southern border and establishing massive fortresses along the Nile. He was a builder, a reformer, and a centralizer. He reduced the power of the nomarchs and ensured that loyalty belonged to the crown. His reign marks the peak of Middle Kingdom power, a moment when Egypt was stable, secure, and respected across the ancient world. Senusret III and his successors pushed Egypt's reach far beyond its borders. To the south into Nubia, rich in gold, ivory, and soldiers. To the east, across the Sinai to mine copper and turquoise. And to the north, trade revived with Byblos, the Levant, and even Minoan Crete. Egypt didn't just rebuild. It reconnected, becoming a hub of wealth, diplomacy, and movement. The Middle Kingdom was a cultural renaissance. Art became more realistic. Statues showed wrinkles, worry, and human emotion. It was no longer about ideal beauty, but truth. In literature, voices expanded. Texts like The Tale of Sinuhe, a story of exile, identity, and return. The Dialogue of a Man with His Soul, a meditation on death. The Instructions of Tahotep, wisdom for living well. For the first time, we hear not just the voices of kings, but of ordinary people, thinkers, dreamers, scribes. The written word became not just sacred, but personal. Religion, too, evolved. Where once only pharaohs entered the afterlife, now middle-class Egyptians began to hope for eternity. Tombs multiplied. Burials included personal prayer books, small Shabti figurines, and inscriptions of sacred spells. The coffin texts, derived from earlier pyramid texts, were written not just for kings, but for anyone who could afford them. Salvation was no longer royal. It was universal, or at least accessible. For nearly 200 years, Egypt thrived. Pyramids were built again, smaller, yes, but still proud. Crops were managed, laws enforced, festivals held. The Nile flowed, and Egypt followed. But beneath the calm, change brewed. The later rulers of the 12th dynasty grew weak. Succession became uncertain, and foreign settlers, known as the Asiatics, began to move into the delta. By the time the 13th dynasty arrived, Egypt had over 50 kings in less than 150 years. Unity was slipping again. The Middle Kingdom was a quiet miracle. Born from war, reborn in wisdom, it gave Egypt back its soul, its pride, its balance. But even the brightest morning carries the seed of night. And as foreign powers stirred in the north, Egypt stood once more on the edge of uncertainty. The storm was coming, and it would be called the Hyksos. Egypt had always ruled itself. From Narmer to Senusret, its kings had worn the double crown. The Nile answered to no foreign master. But now, a new wind blew from the north, and for the first time in its long memory, Egypt bowed its head to foreign kings. They came with horses, with bronze, with strange names and sharper weapons. This was not the fall of Egypt. But it was a pause, a silence before the storm. This was the age of the Hyksos. The Middle Kingdom had brought Egypt back from collapse. But peace does not last forever. By 1700 BCE, the power of the central government began to fade again. The 13th dynasty, once mighty, fell into disorder. Over 50 kings came and went in less than 2 centuries, many ruling for just months. Egypt was losing its grip. In this chaos, new groups from the northeast quietly entered the delta. Traders, nomads, refugees, and eventually warriors. They came not to destroy, they came to stay. By around 1650 BCE, these foreigners had seized control of Lower Egypt. They didn't call themselves conquerors. They called themselves Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands. The Greeks would later call them Hyksos. They didn't burn temples or deface statues. They adopted Egyptian customs, wore Egyptian crowns, worshipped Egyptian gods, and built in Egyptian style. But make no mistake, they were not Egyptian. Their language was Semitic, their weapons unfamiliar, their capital avarice was new, strange, foreign. The Hyksos likely came from Canaan, the region of modern-day Syria and Palestine. They had lived in Egypt peacefully for generations. Merchants, mercenaries, and settlers. But during the collapse, they rose swiftly, seizing power not through invasion, but through opportunity. They brought with them new technologies, horse-drawn chariots unknown in Egypt before, bronze weapons and composite bows, new crops and pottery styles, better fortifications. These tools would forever change Egypt, even after the Hyksos were gone. The Hyksos made their capital in the Nile Delta city of Avaris, in the northeast. Unlike traditional Egyptian cities, Avaris had narrow streets, open courtyards, Semitic inscriptions, temples to Baal and other Near Eastern gods. Yet they respected Egyptian traditions. They inscribed their names in cartouches, reserved for kings. They called themselves sons of Ra. They ruled like pharaohs, but they were never accepted as truly Egyptian. To the native Egyptians, they were always outsiders wearing borrowed crowns. Despite being foreign rulers, the Hyksos brought undeniable innovations. Chariots gave speed and power in battle. Bronze tools improved farming and craftsmanship. New musical instruments, like lyres and lutes, enriched Egyptian culture. Foreign trade networks connected Egypt to the broader Near East. In many ways, they modernized Egypt, but their rule was not welcomed, especially in the south. While the Hyksos ruled the north from Avaris, native Egyptian kings still held power in Thebes, far to the south. These kings, weak in name, strong in spirit, maintained rituals, temples, and traditions. They were known as the 17th dynasty. They paid tribute to the Hyksos for a time, but they did not forget who they were. They saw themselves not as lords of a province, but as rightful rulers of all Egypt. The double crown belonged to them, and one day, they would take it back. From Thebes, resistance began not with armies, but with memory. Priests kept sacred rites alive. Scribes recorded the old laws. Kings prayed to Ammonius, their rising god. This was not just political, it was spiritual. The land needed to be purified, the invaders driven out, and so the fire was lit. The first real spark of war came from a southern king named Akhenaten. His name is still spoken with reverence, not for what he achieved, but for how he died. We know little about his campaigns, but we know how he met his end. His mummy, found in the 19th century, tells the tale. He died from multiple axe blows to the head, likely in battle, a king on the front lines face to face with his enemies. Akhenaten died fighting the Hyksos, and in doing so he passed the torch to his sons. Akhenaten's son, Chamos, was young but bold. He called himself the hawk who swoops on foreign lands. He led direct attacks on Avaris, defeating Hyksos strongholds in the south. In a stele found at Thebes, Chamos declares, "I will sail north and destroy the Asiatics. I shall not leave a single survivor." He pushed the Hyksos back. Not out of Egypt yet, but shaken. Chamos died before the war was won. But he had proved one thing: Egypt would fight back. In the shadows of defeat, a generation of fighters had risen. They had no pyramids, no monuments, only will. But among them stood a boy, Chamos' younger brother. His name was Amos, and he would finish what his father and brother began. He would chase the Hyksos from Egypt. He would rebuild the temples. He would crown himself king of a new Egypt. But that is the story of the new kingdom. The river still flowed. The temples still whispered. But the crown had been stolen. For nearly 100 years, Egypt had waited broken, divided, ashamed. The Hyksos ruled the delta. Foreign names echoed in sacred halls. The gods had grown quiet. But Egypt is not so easily conquered. Like the desert sun, it only sets to rise again. Now, from Thebes, from the bloodline of warriors, a flame was lit, and its name was Amos. Amos was barely a teenager when his father and brother died fighting the Hyksos. He inherited a kingdom in ruins, but a spirit that refused to kneel. With discipline, patience, and fury, Amos I led his army north, recapturing fortress after fortress. He drove the Hyksos out of avarice, out of the delta, and finally out of Egypt altogether. Then he chased them into the Sinai and beyond, not just to defeat them, but to ensure they could never return. This was more than revenge. It was resurrection. Amos reopened temples, rewarded his soldiers with land, and restored order. He became the first king of the 18th dynasty, and with him, Egypt stepped into a new era of power. The 18th dynasty did not just restore Egypt, it expanded it. No longer content with holding their borders, the pharaohs of this dynasty looked outward, to Nubia in the south, Canaan in the north, and beyond the known world. Their armies marched across deserts and rivers. Their envoys sailed to foreign courts. Gold, lapis, ivory, horses. Everything flowed into Thebes. Temples grew, obelisks rose, and behind every stone was the name of a god-king. But one name stands apart, one that still challenges tradition. The name of a woman, Hatshepsut. She was born royal, the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I. She was a wife, a regent, a mother. But when her stepson was too young to rule, Hatshepsut took the throne. Not as queen, but as pharaoh. She wore the royal beard. She adopted the male pronouns, and she ruled with unmatched brilliance. Her reign, unlike others, was marked by peace and prosperity. Trade expeditions were launched to Punt, a land of incense, gold, and mystery. Obelisks were raised at Karnak, still standing tall today. And at Deir el-Bahari, her mortuary temple blended elegance with sacred geometry. She called herself Motker. Truth is the soul of Ra, and for over 2 decades, she ruled Egypt not as a woman, but as a divine ruler. Some later kings tried to erase her name, carving over her images. But stone remembers, and so do we. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally took full power. He did not reign with peace. He reigned with precision. In 17 military campaigns across Syria, Palestine, and Nubia, Thutmose III turned Egypt into an empire. At the Battle of Megiddo, he surrounded enemy forces in a daring maneuver still studied by generals today. Cities fell. Tributes flowed. Foreign princes were brought to Egypt and educated, a clever way to ensure loyalty. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a strategist, a statesman, a scholar. Temples expanded, records detailed, and through it all, he called himself the valiant hawk, soaring above all enemies. By the end of his reign, Egypt controlled more territory than ever before. Egypt had risen from ruin to empire. From warrior queens to world conquerors, the 18th dynasty shaped the fate of nations. But with greatness comes risk. And the next pharaoh would challenge everything Egypt believed, even the gods themselves. Not every golden age shines the same. After the triumphs of Thutmose III, his descendants ruled in peace, until one pharaoh decided to rewrite the world. His name was Amenhotep IV, but history remembers him as Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. He rejected Egypt's entire pantheon of gods. He closed the great temples. He declared that Aten, the sun disk, was the only true god. For the first time, Egypt became monotheistic. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, now known as Amarna. There, in open sunlight, he and his queen Nefertiti ruled in radiant seclusion. But the kingdom trembled. Priests of Ammonius were furious. Foreign powers sensed weakness, and the people were confused. Art changed, becoming soft, surreal, strangely intimate. Pharaohs were shown with elongated faces, potbellies, and bare feet. Akhenaten called it truth, but Egypt called it heresy. And when he died, his name was almost erased from history. In the wake of chaos, a boy took the throne. He was just 9 years old. His name was Tutankhamun, living image of Aten. But as Egypt turned against the heretic sun god, the boy changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. The temples of Ammonius were reopened, old gods restored. The capital moved back to Thebes. Though his reign was short, Tutankhamun symbolized Egypt's return to balance. He died at 18, and his death might have been forgotten. But in 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered his tomb, untouched, filled with gold, and echoing with legend. Today, Tutankhamun is the most famous pharaoh in the world, not for what he did, but for what he left behind. After Tutankhamun's early death and 2 brief reigns, power fell to Horemheb, a seasoned general with no royal blood. He had seen the chaos of Akhenaten. He had served under Tutankhamun, and now he wore the crown. But he didn't just rule. He purged the past. Akhenaten's monuments were torn down, his name chiseled out. Temples were restored, scribes reorganized, priests empowered. Horemheb had no heir, so he appointed his own successor, a fellow military man who would start a new dynasty. His name was Ramesses. History would know him as Ramesses. The 19th dynasty began with Seti I, father of Ramesses II. He restored Egypt's pride abroad, battling Hittites in Syria, rebuilding temples in Thebes, and carving massive reliefs of his victories at Abydos. He was regal, wise, respected, but his son would outshine even him. Ramesses II would become the greatest pharaoh Egypt ever produced. He reigned for over 66 years. He fought great battles, built great temples, fathered over 100 children, and left his mark across the land. He called himself User-Mater Setapenra, strong in Marat, chosen of Ra. The world would call him. Ramesses II's most famous battle was fought early in his reign, against the Hittites at a place called Kadesh in modern-day Syria. He marched with thousands of chariots and warriors, only to be caught in a trap. But Ramesses, according to his own inscriptions, stood his ground. I was alone. None came to me, but I fought with my own hands, and Ra was with me. Though the battle was likely a stalemate, Ramesses claimed glorious victory. His propaganda worked. Statues rose. Temples praised him. He signed the first known peace treaty in history. Back in Egypt, he built with unmatched ambition. Abu Simbel, giant statues carved into a cliff. Ramesseum, his mortuary temple. Additions to Karnak and Luxor. He ruled for so long that when he died, people thought he was eternal. But even empires must age. The gods had returned. The borders were strong. The name of Egypt echoed from Nubia to Canaan. But shadows moved again, not from invaders, but from within. After the long, legendary reign of Ramesses II, his successors struggled to match his greatness. But one pharaoh rose with the strength to protect what remained. His name was Ramesses III, and he ruled during one of the most dangerous moments in Egypt's history. All across the ancient world, civilizations were falling: Mycenae, Ugarit, the Hittites, collapsing one by one. From the sea came mysterious invaders, known only as the Sea Peoples, warriors with strange ships, iron weapons, and unknown tongues. They burned cities, toppled kings, and marched toward Egypt. But Ramesses III was ready. In two brutal campaigns, one on land, one at sea, Ramesses III faced the Sea Peoples head-on. He built massive defensive walls along the Nile Delta. He used archers, chariots, and naval ambushes. And in an inscription at Medinet Habu, he declared, "They came boldly, but their hearts and souls were taken. Their ships and warriors were dragged ashore and killed." Ramesses III defeated them, saving Egypt from the same fate as her neighbors. But victory came at a cost. Egypt survived, but it was wounded. After the battles, something unusual happened. For the first time in recorded history, Egyptian workers went on strike. It was the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign. The state could no longer afford to pay tomb builders in the Valley of the Kings. They marched with dignity, demanding food and justice. The grain stores were low. Temples were underfunded. Foreign trade had collapsed. Even victory couldn't stop the slow decay of empire. Ramesses III was later assassinated in a palace conspiracy, likely by a rival wife and her supporters. His mummy shows a deep throat wound, silenced in death, though he had once defended a nation. The rulers who followed, Ramesses IV through 11, held the throne but not the power. Each Ramesses became weaker, each temple more corrupt. Priests of Ammonius grew so powerful that they ruled Thebes like kings. Tombs were looted, gold stolen. Royal mummies moved in secret, hidden from thieves and time. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt was no longer united. In the north, generals controlled Tanis. In the south, high priests ruled Thebes. There was no true pharaoh left. The Golden Empire was no more. The sun still rose above the Nile. The temples still cast shadows. But the voices inside had faded. The new kingdom had built empires. It had raised queens into kings, fought battles that shaped the world, and worshipped gods with gold and stone and song. But in the end, even greatness tires. Even gods grow quiet. And Egypt, once the ruler of the ancient world, slipped into centuries of division, never to rise so high again. Yet the legacy remained. Obelisks still reached for the sky. Names like Hatshepsut, Thutmose, Akhenaten, Ramesses, still carved in stone, still whispered in sleep. The temples still stood. The sun still rose. But the king's voice no longer carried across the land. The great empire had dimmed. After centuries of pyramids, warriors, and god-kings, Egypt stood divided, not by enemies, but by itself. Pharaohs in name, priests in power, and on the horizon, strangers began to arrive. This was not the end of Egypt, but it was the end of Egypt as it had been. The death of Ramesses XI, the last king of the new kingdom, marked more than a change of ruler. It marked the collapse of central authority. The crown still existed, but it no longer ruled all of Egypt. In the north, new kings ruled from Tanis, a city in the delta. In the south, the great city of Thebes answered only to its priests. There was no war between them, just silence. And Egypt, the unified, glorious Egypt, was now two nations once more. In Thebes, the god Ammonius had become more powerful than any king. His priests controlled land, wealth, and temples. They wore crowns of feathers and led great processions through the city. Soon, the high priest of Ammonius was no longer a servant of the king. He was a king in all but name. He minted coins, led armies, issued decrees. While pharaohs in the north carved their names in stone, in the south it was the priests who ruled. Egypt's divine order had flipped. In the north, a new kind of ruler rose, men of Libyan descent who had long served in Egypt's army. They were not invaders. They were generals, commanders of troops, protectors of borders. They founded the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, ruling from Tanis and Bubastis. Names like Shoshenq I, possibly the Shishak of the Bible, tried to reclaim Egypt's glory. Shoshenq led campaigns into the Levant, restored temples, and carved his triumphs on temple walls. But Egypt was still fractured. These kings held influence but not full power. Every region had its own leader, its own agenda. In this era, co-rulership became normal. At times, Egypt had a pharaoh in Tanis, a high priest in Thebes, a local prince in the Delta, and a rival king ruling Nubia in the far south. The double crown of Egypt was now split into many pieces. Letters, monuments, and tax records show confusion. Whose orders should be followed? Which temple should be funded? Who speaks for the gods? The answer changed, depending on where you stood. Egypt was not dying, but it was drifting. Even in division, Egypt's soul endured. Temples were still built, though smaller. Statues still carved, though less refined. Art showed pharaohs with softer features, priests with scrolls, and foreign styles mingling with native forms. Religion became more personal. Ordinary Egyptians now prayed directly to gods, wrote petitions on papyrus, and carried amulets for protection. While political unity faded, spiritual life blossomed. The gods had not left. Far to the south, in the land once called Kush, a new power had risen. The kings of Nubia, descendants of ancient Egyptian influence, had preserved the old ways. They built pyramids. They worshipped Ammonius. They honored Maat. And in time, they looked north to a divided Egypt and believed it was their duty to restore it. One king would begin that journey. His name was Pi. Around 750 BCE, Pi, king of Kush, marched north from his capital at Napata. He claimed he came not to conquer, but to cleanse, to bring back order, to serve Ammonius and unite the land. City after city submitted to him. Temples welcomed him. Even the Delta rulers bowed before his name. In a great inscription, Pi recorded, "I am not one who acts without Maat. The gods have sent me to restore what is right." He did not crown himself with gold, but with faith. Pi became pharaoh of a united Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty, the Kushite dynasty. Under the Kushite kings, Pi, Shabaka, Taharka, and others, Egypt experienced a cultural revival. Temples were rebuilt in Thebes. Ancient texts were recopied and preserved. Pyramids were built once more, small, steep, and symbolic. Ammonius rose again as Egypt's supreme god. The Kushite rulers called themselves true sons of Egypt. They wore double crowns. They ruled with reverence. And for a brief, shining moment, the Nile remembered its greatness. But beyond Egypt's borders, another empire stirred. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire had become a superpower, ruthless, efficient, and unstoppable. They saw Egypt's unity as a threat, and the rich Nile as a prize. In 701 BCE, Taharka, the Kushite king, clashed with Assyria in defense of Judah. But in the decades that followed, the Assyrians invaded deeper. By 671 BCE, they captured Memphis. Soon after, Thebes was sacked, its temples looted, statues shattered. The Kushite kings retreated south. Their dream of a unified Egypt burned to ash. The land of the pharaohs had fallen again. But this time, there were no pyramids to protect it, no Ramesses to stand at its gates. Egypt was still there, in its people, its gods, its river, but the power was gone. From this point on, Egypt would never again be fully its own. It would pass through foreign hands, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Yet the memory lived on, in broken temples and buried statues, in hymns scratched on tomb walls, in the Nile's endless song. Egypt may have lost its crown, but it had already become immortal. The gods had fallen silent. The pharaoh's throne stood empty, and the sands remembered more than the people did. Egypt had survived conquest before, by drought, by Hyksos, by chaos. But now her temples lay broken. The Nubians had been chased back south. The Assyrians had come and gone, leaving smoke in their wake. And yet, the Nile still flowed. From the ashes of empires, a new flame flickered. One last era of native kings, proud, clever, and unyielding. This was not Egypt's return to glory, but it was Egypt's last stand. After the Assyrians sacked Thebes around 663 BCE, Egypt lay shattered. The south was weakened, the north unstable. But in the western delta, in a quiet but ancient city called Sais, a new leader emerged. His name was Psamtik, son of a governor, trained under foreign powers, but loyal to Egypt's soul. At first, Psamtik ruled only part of the delta, but with cunning diplomacy and well-placed alliances, he slowly reunified Egypt under native leadership. By 664 BCE, Psamtik I was declared pharaoh of all Egypt, founder of the 26th dynasty, the Sate dynasty. He moved the capital to Sais, and from there a renaissance began. Psamtik I ruled with balance. He honored the past, restoring temples, sponsoring priests, reviving old rituals. But he also embraced the present, working with foreign powers, encouraging trade, and hiring foreign soldiers to strengthen his army. His rule marked the beginning of Egypt's last golden flicker, a time of peace, prosperity, and cultural revival. For nearly 150 years, the kings of the 26th dynasty ruled wisely. Necho II expanded the navy and sent explorers around Africa. Psamtik II campaigned in Nubia. Apries built coastal defenses. Ramesses formed strong ties with Greek cities. These kings walked a tightrope, balancing tradition and change, Egypt and empire, past and present. The world was changing. Assyria had fallen. Babylon was rising. The Persians would come next. Egypt's kings knew they couldn't survive alone. So, for the first time, foreign mercenaries were brought into the Egyptian army at scale. Greek hoplites from Ionia, Carians from Anatolia, Phoenician sailors from Lebanon, even Jewish soldiers stationed at frontier garrisons. At places like Elephantine and Memphis, these soldiers guarded temples and trade routes. They didn't weaken Egypt, they protected it. This new multicultural military allowed Egypt to hold its ground in an increasingly connected and dangerous world. The Sate pharaohs didn't just rebuild Egypt's strength. They revived its spirit. They looked back to the Old Kingdom, the age of Djoser and Sneferu, and mimicked the art, architecture, and religion of ancient days. Statues showed idealized pharaohs in stiff, eternal poses. Temples were reconstructed in Karnak, Memphis, and Sais. Obelisks were raised. Hieroglyphs returned to an older, more formal style. They weren't just copying the past. They were preserving it, knowing that Egypt's legacy mattered more than ever. Even the language of government returned to classical Middle Egyptian. It was a cultural rewind, elegant, reverent, deliberate. Egypt had found peace once more, not through empire, but through memory. But peace rarely lasts, and across the eastern horizon, new empires marched, bearing tribute, swords, and silence. The Sate kings knew they were not alone. Egypt, once a sealed world, was now part of a global web of merchants, sailors, and soldiers. They opened their ports to Phoenician traders, who brought cedarwood, purple dye, and glass. They welcomed Greek merchants into a new port called Naucratis, the first permanent Greek colony in Egypt. Here, Hellenic temples stood beside Egyptian ones. Priests debated philosophy. Ships loaded with olives and linen crossed the sea. These foreign contacts brought wealth, influence, and new ideas, but also new risks. Because not far to the east, an empire was growing fast. In 525 BCE, Egypt's peace shattered. The Persian king Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, marched west. At the Battle of Pelusium near the Nile Delta, Egyptian forces collapsed. Legend says Cambyses used sacred animals, like cats, on his shields, knowing the Egyptians would not dare harm them. Whether true or not, Egypt fell swiftly. Cambyses entered Memphis. Temples were looted. Egypt was no longer ruled by pharaohs, but by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cambyses declared himself pharaoh, but his rule was cold. Years later, the Persian king Darius I tried to soften this image. He restored some temples, supported religious festivals, allowed local officials to remain, but Egypt remained a vassal state, proud but powerless. Egypt never accepted foreign rule lightly. Between 404 and 343 BCE, Egyptians launched a series of rebellions, reclaiming their throne multiple times. These brief dynasties, 28th, 29th, and 30th, were short-lived, but fierce. Kings like Amartius and Nephrod fought to restore independence. Tachos and Teos allied with Greek mercenaries. Temples were rebuilt again. Statues of gods reappeared in every city. This final burst of native rule was urgent, defiant, and filled with pride. But none stood taller than one last king. Ruling from 360 to 343 BCE, Nectanebo II was Egypt's final native king. He was a builder, a reformer, and a deeply religious man. He restored temples across the land: Horus at Edfu, Isis at Philae, Ammonius at Karnak. He financed walls and forts to defend Egypt's borders. He called upon Greek allies to help hold back the Persian tide. And for a time, it worked. Nectanebo ruled in peace. He walked in ancient footsteps. He wore the crown of Narmer, of Khufu, of Ramesses. But he could not stop history. In 343 BCE, the Persian king Artaxerxes III returned with a vast army. This time, they came prepared with spies, betrayals, and overwhelming force. Despite Nectanebo's defense, the Persian armies swept through the delta. Memphis fell. Temples burned. The gods were silenced again. Nectanebo fled south, likely to Nubia, and was never seen again. With his fall, Egypt's line of native kings ended forever. He was the last son of Horus, the last voice of Ammonius' court, the last to wear the red and white crown not as a conqueror, but as a child of the Nile. After Nectanebo II fled south, Egypt came fully under Persian rule again. It became a satrapy, a province governed by a Persian official. The Persians built fortresses, levied taxes, and kept Egypt quiet through military might. But they did not understand Egypt. They ruled by sword, not by soul. And while they honored some temples and traditions, the heart of Egypt no longer beat in the palace. The gods were distant, the rituals shallow, the sacred Nile flowed, but the land no longer felt its spirit. This was Egypt in chains, proud, beautiful, but under a foreign sky. Yet even now, Egypt did not vanish. The people still built temples, still spoke in proverbs, still named their children after ancient gods. Priests continued to perform daily rituals, lighting incense, reciting hymns, offering bread and beer to stone statues. The farmers still looked to Sirius in the sky, marking the flood's return. Scribes still copied ancient texts, some written 1,000 years earlier. Egypt was no longer free, but it was not forgotten. It lived in the memory of its people, and soon, it would live again in the mind of a conqueror. In 332 BCE, a new power approached from the west. His name was Alexander, a Macedonian tutored by Aristotle, a warrior who had defeated the Persians and claimed the legacy of Achilles. When he marched into Egypt, the people did not resist. They welcomed him. Why? Because he did something the Persians never did. He prayed at the temples. He sacrificed to Ammonius. He declared himself son of the god, just like a pharaoh would. He visited Siwa Oasis, where the oracle of Ammonius confirmed his divine right to rule Egypt. He did not conquer Egypt. He embraced it, and in doing so, he ended the late period and began the age of Greco-Roman Egypt. Egypt had ruled itself for over 3,000 years, from Narmer to Nectanebo, from mud-brick tombs to golden pyramids, from falcon gods to sun temples. But now the age of native kings was over. No more would a man born on the Nile wear the double crown. No more would Thebes call the world to prayer. No more would a pharaoh be god, priest, and general in one. And yet, Egypt endured, not as an empire, but as a legend. Her stories would echo through Greek scrolls, Roman libraries, Islamic scholars, and modern eyes. Her temples would crumble, but her gods would never be forgotten. Her river would flow, her pyramids would stand, her mysteries would survive, because Egypt was never just a kingdom. It was an eternity carved in stone. Egypt had watched empires rise and fall, had welcomed gods and buried kings. She had stood beside the Nile for 3,000 years, and now she waited for one last ruler. He did not come from the desert. He did not pray in Thebes. He came from the north with a lion's step and a scholar's eyes. He wore no crown of reeds or feathers, but Egypt bowed to him all the same. His name was Alexander, and with him, the world changed. In 332 BCE, after defeating the Persians in Syria, Alexander the Great turned toward Egypt. But Egypt did not resist him. To the people tired of Persian rule, Alexander felt like a liberator, not a conqueror. When he entered Memphis, he was crowned as pharaoh. He offered sacrifices to Apis, the sacred bull. He honored the old gods. He followed the sacred rites. Then he made a sacred journey across the desert to the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis. There, in a lonely temple beneath the sun, the priests declared, "You are the son of Ammonius, the son of Ra." Alexander left not just as a conqueror, but as a god-king in the eyes of Egypt. Before leaving Egypt to continue his conquests eastward, Alexander made one final world-changing decision. On the Mediterranean coast, where the Nile met the sea, he founded a new city. He called it Alexandria. It would not be Egyptian. It would not be Greek. It would be both. A city of wide avenues and marble temples, of Egyptian priests and Greek philosophers, of ports, markets, libraries, and light. Alexander never saw it finished. He died young in Babylon at the height of his empire. But Alexandria would become his greatest legacy. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, took Egypt. He claimed Alexander's body, had it embalmed in the Egyptian style, and brought it to Memphis, then Alexandria. He would build a tomb and a dynasty. Ptolemy I declared himself pharaoh, and began the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal house that would govern Egypt for nearly 300 years. But the Ptolemies were clever. They did not erase Egypt's culture. Instead, they wore the double crown. They sacrificed in Egyptian temples. They spoke Greek, but prayed in hieroglyphs. They built a kingdom that was foreign in blood, but Egyptian in spirit. And through this delicate fusion, Egypt thrived once more. The old gods still stood, but now, beside them, rose marble columns and Hellenic chants. Egypt had a new heart, not in Thebes but in Alexandria. And from this city of two souls would come both brilliance and betrayal. Ptolemy Isoter, the first Greek pharaoh of Egypt, ruled with clarity. He did not try to be an Egyptian king in the old sense. He ruled as both a strategos, general, and a divine pharaoh, balancing Greek order with Egyptian tradition. Under his rule, Egypt was stable, wealthy, and respected. His son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, expanded trade, married his sister, following Egyptian custom, and filled Alexandria with knowledge and gold. Under Ptolemy III, Egypt reached the peak of its Ptolemaic power. The army pushed into Syria and Asia Minor. Temples were restored across the Nile Valley. Priests were rewarded. Greek cities flourished in the Delta. It was not a perfect unity, but for a time it worked. The most dazzling jewel of the Ptolemaic world wasn't gold or land. It was knowledge. At the heart of Alexandria stood the Great Library, a place where all the world's texts were gathered, copied, and preserved. Scrolls from Babylon, India, Athens, Persia, all brought here. Legend says the library held over 400,000 scrolls. Mathematicians like Euclid taught here. Astronomers like Eratosthenes measured the Earth's circumference. Physicians advanced anatomy and medicine. Beside the library rose the museum, a temple of the muses, where scholars debated, dined, and dreamed. It was the brain of the ancient world. Meanwhile, temples across Egypt were rebuilt and expanded. Philae sacred to Isis, Edfu devoted to Horus, Kam Ambo to Sobek the crocodile god. The Ptolemies knew, to rule Egypt, you must also worship her. Egypt under the Ptolemies was a world of blended identities. The rulers were Greek, but wore pharaonic crowns. Statues showed them in both Egyptian and Hellenistic style. Festivals honored Dionysus beside Osiris. Sacred texts were written in both Greek and Demotic Egyptian. Even the gods began to merge. Serapis, a new deity, combined traits of Osiris and Zeus. Temples housed statues with Greek features and Egyptian symbols. This was not imitation. It was adaptation, a way for Greeks and Egyptians to live under the same sky. But beneath the harmony, cracks were forming. The early Ptolemies were disciplined, but later rulers descended into jealousy, paranoia, and violence. Brothers married sisters to keep the bloodline pure. Queens poisoned rivals. Sons rebelled against fathers. Civil wars broke out across the Nile. Egypt became a palace of whispers, intrigue ruling the court, while Rome watched from afar. As generations passed, the Ptolemies grew weaker, richer, and more isolated. They ruled not from the land, but from behind marble walls. And yet, from this chaos, one final queen would rise, a woman unlike any the world had seen. Her name was Cleopatra. Temples still rang with chants. Scholars still read in candlelight. But thunder rolled beyond the sea, and the final act of Egypt's ancient story had begun. Her name echoes like a whisper through time. Cleopatra. Born around 69 BCE, Cleopatra VII was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic line. But unlike her ancestors, she did something extraordinary. She learned to speak Egyptian, the first of her dynasty to do so. She studied medicine, astronomy, politics, and philosophy. She ruled not from shadow, but with fire. When she took the throne, Egypt was divided, surrounded by Roman power and drowning in debt. But Cleopatra was not afraid. She would use her mind, her voice, her beauty, and her country's past to try and save it. When her brother tried to remove her from power, Cleopatra turned to Rome. In 48 BCE, she secretly entered Alexandria, rolled in a carpet, and was delivered before Julius Caesar. The Roman general was impressed, not just by her appearance, but by her presence. Together, they defeated her brother, secured her throne, and forged an alliance. They sailed the Nile. They studied temples. They had a son, Caesarion, who she claimed as Caesar's heir. For a moment, Egypt stood tall again. But in Rome, Caesar's enemies stirred. He was assassinated in 44 BCE, and Cleopatra's fate would now tie to another Roman. Her next alliance was with Mark Antony, Caesar's former general. Together, they ruled the Eastern Mediterranean as lovers, partners, and monarchs. Cleopatra bore him 3 children. They lived in luxury and ceremony, hosting banquets, restoring temples, declaring Caesarion king. But in Rome, another power rose, Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's rival. The stage was set for a final battle, Rome versus Egypt. At Actium, in 31 BCE, Roman and Egyptian navies clashed. Cleopatra and Antony were defeated. They fled to Alexandria. There, surrounded by fading grandeur, they awaited their end. In 30 BCE, as Octavian approached the gates of Alexandria, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, days later, dressed in royal robes and took her own life, possibly with a venomous SP. With her death, Egypt fell. Caesarion was killed. The temples were quiet. Egypt became a Roman province. No more pharaohs, no more crowns, no more kingdoms beside the Nile. It was the end of Egypt's 3,000-year journey of native rule. She began in shadows with kings of clay and reed. She rose in stone with pyramids and prayers. She ruled in gold beside the gods. And she ended not in battle, but in memory. The pharaohs were gone. But Egypt, the idea of Egypt, remained. Her gods became myths, her cities, ruins, her stories eternal. From Caesar to Napoleon, from archaeologists to dreamers, Egypt whispered through time, not as a fallen kingdom, but as a timeless one, because Egypt was never just a land. She was immortality written in stone.